Hello YouTube, it is me again, back with another video, and this time I'm going to get into a character introduction, but before I do, I want to throw out a big fat disclaimer. This universe is dark and twisted and deals with a lot of adult content, so if you can't handle that, or if you think that this might be a little too mature for you, I highly recommend that you steer clear, because it talks about some more adult content. It's not super explicit, but it does have to do with some darker topics. Anyway, that aside, let's get into the introduction of Dennis Colt. So, throughout his arc and throughout the rest of this video, I will refer to him simply as Colt, because that is what he goes by. That is what he's known as. So that will be how I talk about this character from here on out. So, Colt was raised with a single widowed mother and pretty much no money to their name. This was in the time before the debt laws were really established, at least when he was born and when he was young. He had nothing to his name, and as much as he wanted to stay in school, his family was deeply impoverished. His mother worked as many jobs as she possibly could and broke her back trying to provide for her family, but oftentimes it just wasn't enough. The world was still splintered after a major war, even years later. The ramifications of the war could be seen for decades, and it was very obvious that they weren't doing well. So she tried to get other jobs, but she could hardly hold down more than 3 jobs at a time, and so Colt stepped up. Despite only being in middle school, he dropped schooling altogether and decided that he was going to help his mother by getting odd jobs and running errands. It was around this time that one of Colt's childhood friends, a man by the name of Archibald Dean, or a boy at this point named Archibald Dean, sort of had his own set of instances in his life, which I'll get into in his video, and he kind of joined the household. So the 2 boys ended up kind of trading off. One would go to school one day and that person would work, and just enough to get them through the basics of high school with some form of education. This was not the boy's idea, but rather at Colt's mother's insistence. She promised him that she would not see him go without graduating high school. She would not see either of them go without graduating high school. So the boys very reluctantly traded days. On the days where one would work, the other would school. On the days where one would school, the other would work. It was not a perfect arrangement, and they still barely managed to put food on the table most days, but they were happy. The 3 of them had each other, and even though it was an odd family and an odd arrangement, it worked well for them because they cared about each other. They had each other's backs no matter what. As my family likes to say, always for each other. That was very much something that rang true for them. So eventually both boys graduated high school and threw themselves headfirst into work, but with working 3, sometimes 4 jobs, Colt's mother wasn't doing very well. She was getting on in years, and she was quite sick and tired. She had to drop her workload just to keep herself above water most of the time. It meant a lot of economic hardship, but the boys and now their mother could still work at least 1 job. Both boys took on 2 or 3 jobs whenever they could, but finding jobs was hard. People often couldn't afford to pay their employees, so they would lay people off. Finding steady work was almost impossible. It was at this point that the debt laws were established and enforcers and facilitators were put in place. Archibald, otherwise known as Arch, was never really the kind of guy to go into combat. It just wasn't for him. So he instead worked menial labor jobs in a factory where he would repair and kind of install machinery. That was his job, and that was what he did with his life. It was something he was fairly good at, even if he kind of hated it. Colt, on the other hand, recognized the security of being an enforcer, and he figured he could be a force of good in the world. So he signed up, went through the rigorous training regimen, and off he went. He was an enforcer. He wanted nothing more than to keep people safe, but found oftentimes he was put in impossible situations. It was a hard, demanding job that required him to do some bad things things that he wasn't always sure were the right decision. Of course, he was just doing it because he had no other option, right? That logic only got him so far, and one day, while having a deep existential crisis on the inside, he met the woman who would soon become his wife. It was meeting her and realizing the good in her that made him really step back and realize the bad in the rest of the world, the bad he was contributing to. And so, much to his regret, he had to leave a well-paying job because it just wasn't morally right to him anymore. Around this same time, his mother finally passed away. It was a hard and harrowing time in his life, but now he had his new wife, Emily, and he had his brother for a short time before Arch met a woman of his own and moved across the country. It wasn't easy. Nothing was ever really easy. But now that he had Emily and he had something of a stable foundation, he ended up taking Arch's old job. He was able to support him and his wife, and he was able to find happiness. He was able to grieve his mother and come to terms with her death. It was a lot for a young man to take onto his shoulders in a world that was not built for success. But, all things considered, he could be happy. It wasn't perfect, but it was his. He and Emily got a house, and they settled down. It was rickety and always in need of repair in one way or another, but they made do. His job brought in enough for them to eat at least every day, once a day, at least. And things were okay. He started to kind of gain a little bit more work as he got better and more skilled at what he did. He was recognized, given a few promotions, and eventually they were eating with some stability every day, 3 times a day. Mostly. It was better off than most people he'd ever really known, and he was thrilled. He was living somewhat comfortably. That was unheard of. To him, the world was all shaping up, and even though there was a lot of furious political debate in the world, he was seeing fewer riots. That had to be a good thing. He believed it was a good thing. He had to believe it was a good thing. The debt laws were still very much in effect, and they troubled him. But he never thought too hard on it. For him, it was always one of those out-of-sight, out-of-mind things that are just too awful to think about. That political thing that you know is there and you know it should be discussed, but the more you think about it, the more upset you get, and you never really want to talk about it. That is until Emily got pregnant. Colt was thrilled. He wanted nothing more than to be a father. He wanted nothing more than to be a good father. He wanted nothing more than to raise a child with Emily, and their dreams were finally coming true. But so too were some of his nightmares. He realized he needed to make a move. He needed to ensure that his child would never be taken, or that his child's children would never be taken. It was a really hard decision to come to, but ultimately, he and another one of his co-workers, someone he had grown rather close to, decided that they were going to take a leap. They were going to take out a loan, share the payments together, and build a business together. They would do specialized automotive repair, and they would help get people back into cars. It would be a lucrative business once they got it off the ground, and they knew it. It would require selling to the government, but even though that wasn't exactly what they wanted, and it's not always something they were fully comfortable with, it would mean that their children would be safe, and that was all that mattered. Colt's little girl was born, and Colt was still saving up enough to apply for this loan. He absolutely adored little Eleanor. She was his world. Everything was perfect and beautiful. He couldn't have asked for more. Then he finally applied for his loan, and hallelujah, he was accepted. He was given a lump sum of money, and things seemed to be really looking up for him. He started to plan out the business, and he bought the things that he needed, and he started to make his payments on time. Things were really going well. At least, so he thought. You see, Colt's co-worker hadn't been entirely honest. He was falling into deeper debt day by day, and his son was at risk of being taken. He knew it was coming. He knew it was soon. He realized very quickly that he couldn't afford to pay this loan anymore, and he had to just do something. So he took what more of the money he could, took all of the profits, took all of the lump sum, and robbed Colt blind, just to save his son. He paid off his debts and disappeared across the country. Colt would never see him or his son or his wife ever again. He, Emily, and Eleanor were not only destitute, but completely bankrupt. They had nothing to their name, except a whole lot of debt. As you can imagine, this is the exact opposite of what Colt wanted. He tried his very best to keep an optimistic attitude. He fought, he got as many odd jobs as he could, but he kept falling further and further behind, and eventually, the government took notice. Colt wasn't expecting them when they broke into his home. They blew the door off its hinges. They stormed into his house and demanded everyone put their hands up. Colt stood up to try and explain what was going on. He just wanted to understand what was happening. He was hit. He fell to the ground unconscious. What he wouldn't see, but would soon learn, was that his wife tried to fight. Emily wanted nothing more than to keep her daughter safe. She tried to fight for her daughter's freedom. She screamed for Eleanor to run. But a toddler can only go so far, and Emily wasn't strong enough to fend the enforcers off. He threw her backwards and she fell, collapsing into a table and hitting her head off the corner. She collapsed into a pool of her own blood. She would die there. Eleanor was taken all before Colt was awake. By the time he came to, looking around, he found no one but his wife, who had already died. His child was gone. His door was gone, his home was raided. It was just a house with no door. Nothing was left. Colt was devastated. He didn't want to go on in a life like this. Arch, realizing that his brother was going through the worst period of his life, came back. He moved back in and tried to keep Colt afloat, but when a man doesn't want to live, he often has no will to fight for his own survival. Colt was miserable. He drowned his sorrows in alcohol, and eventually it became the only thing that gave him any sort of solace. Even the comfort of his longtime friend, his impromptu brother, it wasn't enough. He was miserable. He was drowning in his own grief, and he wanted to die. He just hoped that he could drink himself into an early grave and go and be with his wife. He knew that he would never see his daughter again. No one ever really did when they were poor. Sometimes the rich would get their kids back and it would be a huge public event. But most of the time, even they never got to see their kids again. No one really knew what happened to the kids once they turned 18. No one knows if they go somewhere, if they're sent somewhere, if they're just allowed to leave. What happens when they're no longer eligible to pay off their family's debt? No one knows. And besides, Colt didn't want to live long enough to find out. He didn't want to live long enough to find out that his daughter was dead, or dying, or worse. He couldn't handle it anymore. He just wanted to die. And so he went into a bar one night intending to drink more than his body could handle. Fortunately, the bartender, a young man by the name of Martin, but who introduced himself as Marty, kind of quietly talked Colt down and let him pass out in a back booth. Arch quickly arrived a short time later, scanning for him, and was told by Marty that he had passed out and that he wanted to hurt himself. Arch was exhausted and devastated, and realizing there was nothing he could do for his friend right now, no immediate medical care that could do anything, nothing he could do at all, he sat at the bar for a while and tried to talk through with Marty, who at this point was a stranger. He wanted to figure out what he could do. He explained his brother's situation, and Marty let him in on a little secret. Sometimes the best way to get someone to want to be sober, to want to live, is to give them something to live for, something to fight for. Marty told him about a clandestine meeting of rebels and told him that if he could convince Colt to sober up and bring him to one of the meetings of the rebellion. He thinks that it could do a lot to save Colt's life. It was that fateful decision and the conversation that followed that convinced Colt that he needed to drop the bottle so that he could fight, so that he could make sure that this never happened again, though admittedly that was secondary to just revenge. He wanted to hurt the people who would hurt him more than he wanted to die. It was his only purpose for a long time. After a while, he also wanted the more noble things. He wanted to save people and protect people. And those instincts, the want to save the world and to make it better, did shine through when he was sober enough to understand the person that he'd left behind. Still, he couldn't let go of his wife's death or his daughter's absence. Staying sober was hard. But luckily, the more he met with rebellion members and the closer he got with Marty, the more difficult it became to get alcohol, especially considering the rebellion is in a bar called the Escalade. I hope you appreciate that pun, because I love it. So that's sort of where Colt ends up in the story. He has a mediocre job working at a factory making machine parts. It's not glamorous, but it's all that he really needs. It's just enough to keep himself alive. And he goes to the Escalade at night and meets with the rebellion. The rebellion can't do a lot. The law and the enforcers are still a horribly strict force, but he's doing everything he can to undermine the government and ensure that nothing happens like what happened to him again. So that is sort of where the story picks up for him. That is where he is when the story starts. That's who he is. He's mostly sober. He's still deeply traumatized and deeply troubled, but he hasn't touched alcohol in several years by this point. He's always tempted, but he finds his ways to stay strong by remembering his wife, whose wedding ring he wears around his neck. It's incredibly, incredibly cheap, and probably some form of plastic or wood, and he understands that it has no material value. It doesn't need any. It was his wife's. So that is sort of his depressing story, but also the story of how a man becomes a rebel. So I hope that you enjoyed. I will hopefully get more into how he is affected by some of the other characters in the series. I will be talking about another character, Chastity. I will also go into Archibald Dean and some of the other people. I'll go into Marty's backstory a little bit more, and I hope that you enjoy all of them because I love my characters so much, and I can't explain to you how thrilled I am that you guys love them too. I was so surprised to hear that you guys wanted to hear more about this dark and twisty universe, and honestly, I'm really excited. So hopefully you guys love this as much as I do, and that said, have a good morning, evening, afternoon, nighttime, time of day, and I will catch you guys in the next video. If you're subscribed, which you should be, and you should also hit up that notification bell, follow me on Instagram and Twitter and all the social medias, and I will catch you guys in the next video.